So this is something I've really been looking forward to for a long time. I mean, you know, like they've run out of prizes to give Vint. So the Queen Elizabeth had to invent a new prize so that Vint could get one more prize, and he's about to go over there, and he's been working through all the protocol of how you deal with Her Majesty. Anyway, as you know, Vint is one of the people who invented the internet, and he, you know, most people think the internet started like with web browsers, which would say 93, 94. I mean, the work that Vint and his colleagues had done was already over 20 years earlier than that we've had an internet. And that during most of that time, it was exponentially growing. So he's seen the entire history of the internet from when he started it with his colleagues and in the early 70s. So what I wanted to do was to ask him to, from that perspective of 4 decades, take us through how it's become so much more dangerous an environment. We heard from Jeff some of the things that are going on. It didn't used to be. It was sort of a nice place early on. But Vint, give us a little bit of a history.
I'll be happy to do that, but before I do, I have 2 things I want to point out. First of all, I should be interviewing Larry. I mean, you all know Larry, I hope, and you know how huge an impact he's had on science and technology and policy especially. He's extraordinary at helping people understand why it's important to invest in science and engineering and the like. And of course, he's done some pretty spectacular things, and he's running Cal IT too. So I hope there's an opportunity, if this has not been done before, to have you interviewed, and I'll be happy to do the vice versa at some point. So that's the first point. The second one, I was listening to Mark's talk last night, and it's clear he was very enthusiastic about getting things done, to make something happen. And I really resonate with that. As an engineer, you want stuff to work. It's not enough to write a paper or have an idea. But I do want to urge you to take advantage of the fact that you're surrounded by people who have ideas. And one of the most important things you could come away with from meetings like this, events like this, is new ideas and new perspective. Even if nothing else happens, if you come away thinking, boy, I didn't think about that before, well, that's a different perspective than I had, that's real gold, that's real value. So please keep that in mind as you continue to participate in the events. A long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. I feel like Yoda when I think about it. What is it that he said? I'm not afraid. You will be. Right. Okay. Which is relevant to the security question. So, look, when this stuff got started, Bob Kahn and I had already had 4 years of experience with the ARPANET, which was launched in September of 1969, first node installed at UCLA. And so by the time we begin thinking about internet, we've already seen Doug Engelbart's online system. We've seen hyperlinking. We've seen portrait mode displays, black on white, and the mouse, and so on. Dan Lynch is waving in the background. There's Dan. Dan was running the SRI computer facilities at the time, and then moved down to ISI. Then started Interop. I mean, you've got people in the audience here who have had a great deal to do with the way in which this thing evolved. And Dan gets a lot of credit for drawing attention to internet and its technology. So by the time 73 rolls around, email has been invented 2 years before, in 1971, and we're all crazy about it. And we saw the social networking element of it right away, because within a few weeks of email being announced, from Bolt, Beranek, and Newman and Ray Tomlinson, several distribution lists were created. One of them was called Yum Yum, which is about restaurants in the Palo Alto areas, critics. And the other one was Sci-Fi Lovers, because we were all geeks and we all read science fiction, which comes back to the point that Larry made earlier, that it was a very homogeneous environment, a whole bunch of geeks, a bunch of engineers who wanted to make something work. So they were completely committed both to the ARPANET and the smaller team, Sherpa team, doing the internet. And it stayed that way for a very long time. The National Science Foundation gets involved in the mid-1980s with the NSFNet, a very important step because it opened up this networking capability to the research community supported by NSF. NSF did some brilliant things. First of all, they had this core network, the NSFNet, and they said, we don't want the people running the core network to have to deal with 3,000 universities around the country, so let's create intermediate level networks that will serve the universities, and they will be connected to the NSFNet backbone. So the NSFNet backbone now creates this hierarchical structure. ARPANET is running alongside of it until 1990 when it's basically terminated. So NSFNet is probably the most important backbone. And when 1988 rolls around, I went to an interop show that Dan was running, and I walked in, Dan, with Eric Benamou, who was, by that time, may have been the CEO of 3Com. And when we walked in, I saw a 2-story display from Cisco Systems, and my first reaction was, holy crap, I wonder how much that costs. So I asked Eric, and he says, well, it could be $250,000, which is a lot of money back in 1988. And he said, then there's the cost of manning it for a week. And I just stopped, with my jaw dropping, thinking, my God, somebody thinks they're going to make money out of this. And then I thought, well, how is the general public going to get access to the internet? And I couldn't imagine that the U.S. government would pay for every individual's access to the net, even though we had benefited from NSF and DARPA funding of our research. So I thought, well, there's a problem because we can't put commercial traffic on the internet backbone. So I went to the Federal Networking Council, which was in charge of the policy for internet, at least in the U.S., and I said, would it be okay if I connected the MCI mail system, the commercial email system, up to the internet as an experiment? And of course, the subtext was to break the barrier that said no commercial traffic on the government-run backbones. So my theory was that if we could get commercial traffic on the backbone, we could demonstrate to the, at least to industry, that the internet was a useful thing to have without any ISP having to go and build a backbone first in order to exploit this and demonstrate utility. So they said yes. So we put MCI mail up on the net around 1989 in the summertime. And as soon as it was announced that MCI mail was connected to the internet, all the other email carriers said, wait a minute, those guys at MCI can't have this special privilege. We want to be connected too. Yeah. So CompuServe got connected, and Telemail got connected, and OnTime got connected. And then they discovered something very funny, because they had been completely separate from each other, but they had to meet the same internet email standards, right, which meant they could communicate with each other. And they were all kind of stunned when they realized that being connected to the internet meant their email systems now interworked.
Well, the funny thing about that is, as we were watching, of course, the NCSA, the supercomputer center that I created in '85, was one of the 5 that was linked together to form this NSFNet backbone. And so we saw .edu, and we saw .gov, and we saw .mil all the time. And around 1990, exactly as you say, I said, what the hell is this .com thing? Like, I've never seen that before. And who are these parasites on our network?
Well, actually, my colleagues hated the idea of having the general public involved in that. Why would you let these unwashed rabble get access to our toy, right? So not everybody received this positively. But what happens now, of course, Tim Berners-Lee invents the World Wide Web, and it doesn't really show up too much until Mark Andreessen and Eric Bina did the Mosaic version around 1992. And at this point, it is stunning, right? Because we're seeing images and text, and at some point, audio and video. On the net, it looked like a magazine instead of Unix text-based command line. And this was transforming for everyone, as I'm sure you all know. It became much more visible to the general public when Netscape Communications launched its IPO. And at that point, the dot boom starts, and a bunch of people with no business models at all get venture capital people to pour incredible amounts of money in. The dot boom tears ahead until April of 2000 when it goes poof. But one important thing to note, at this point I'm at MCI and we're running a major backbone. we were seeing traffic on the net and the number of hosts on the net and the number of users on the net doubling every single year starting in 1988. There was demand there independent of this dot boom phenomenon, and that demand continued to grow. It's not doubling every year now, but it's still growing at 25 or 30%. So, of course, we have new demand showing up on the net. The two things that have happened that are pretty dramatic, one of them is mobiles, plainly. A new mechanism for getting access to network resources. The two systems, the internet and the mobile, are mutually reinforcing because the mobile doesn't do everything in the app that's loaded. The app is often executed by some machine somewhere on the internet. So these two things reinforce each other in a really dramatic way. The second thing, of course, is the bandwidth's been going up. And so the consequence is delivery of video and video conferencing, things like that. Google Hangouts is an example. Netflix is another example. All of that is driving a substantial amount of demand for absolute capacity. On top of all that, and the subject of our discussion this morning, is that commerce is clearly increasing. Each of us is using it for personal uses. Our businesses are using the net for a variety of transactions. There's B2B and G2B and P2P and whatever you want to pick your favorite letter. All those things are relying on the net to be reliable and to be trustable. And as you've already heard, it is not entirely so. What we see now is the universe of human beings on the network. Not all of them have everyone else's interests at heart. And so we have real challenges in the network, and it needs to be fixed. It's not necessary, in my view, to start all over again, although that's an interesting exercise to undertake. What would happen if I had a clean sheet of paper? One of the outcomes of that particular perspective is the open flow design coming out of Stanford, which is a very, very interesting design alternative. It can do everything that packet switching does, but it does more. It's separated the control away from the data path, which makes it more secure. And it uses any bits in the packet, not just the address bits, if you wish.
So, Vint, if I just experientially think back, I don't remember until in the 90s that even things like spam were showing up. And that was sort of annoying. But then viruses and worms, and then, of course, the famous worm. And so those were kind of like, okay, why are people doing this? And it would, be but it was kind of, again, this annoying thing. But then identity theft starts.
Then it got serious.
And phishing and then bank extortion and now wholesale IP theft, not just, Russian mafia or something, but it looks like state actors and at least in some cases. And then now the vulnerability of so much of our national infrastructure. So it's like the threat level has just been raising and raising.
So, the vulnerabilities are there. And in fact, every one of you who has anything to do with trying to make this a more trusted environment, trying to make it a more reliable one, has a responsibility to do that. I worry a lot about people who write software for the various systems, from the application level all the way down to the fundamentals of routing. Should feel a responsibility for making this a safer place to be. The language that we use is in some ways a disservice, because you hear about cybersecurity, then you think about national security, and you think about national state actors and so on. You hear about criminals. And the problem is not all the disruptions that occur on the net are a consequence of criminal activity. Some of them are just mistakes. There's a good example is one where the Pakistani government told the Pakistanis that they should block YouTube because something on YouTube was offensive to the Pakistani government. So the engineers went off to try to block YouTube by advertising a more precise IP address for YouTube, which propagated not only inside of Pakistan, but halfway around the world. So YouTube got wiped out over half of the world for a while. And, we said, wait a minute, we had to fix that. And when we asked, they said, oh, there was a mistake. And I actually believe them. I don't think they were trying to do that. They just messed up. And we've messed up at Google a couple of times. When we go through the net and we're crawling around trying to see whether there's a website with malware, and we mark that site as being potentially dangerous. One day, somebody manually edited that list Now, normally the way the behavior of the system is if you use the Google search engine, you go to a place that has been marked as malware. We put up this big red page saying, don't go there, we think there's malware. But you can still go there, you just have to force the system to do that. Well, the editing mistake caused every page in the internet to be marked as malware. And so no matter where you went, these big red pages were popping up. Of course, we heard about that pretty quickly and figured out what the problem was and fixed it. But I want to emphasize that mistakes can happen and they can appear to be attacks. The reason that that's so important in this discussion is that if you decide to adopt a posture of response to what you believe to be an attack, the question is, where should you respond? How do you validate that the party that you're going to respond to is, in fact, the perpetrator? And to give you, if you don't mind, an example of a dangerous posture to adopt. Let's suppose that company X, maybe it's a bank, something important in our infrastructure, is under denial of service attack. And the conclusion is that we are going to launch a counterattack. We, for some value of we, is going to launch a counterattack against all the machines that are sending these DOS packets at us. And so, and we're going to make sure they understand that they shouldn't do this again, right? So we're going to wipe out their disk drives. So imagine now that we're going to wipe out about 1 million PCs. And we do that, and then we discover that those 1 million PCs were in the U.S., they were infected, they belonged to people like you and me. Yeah. We didn't know they were infected. We weren't involved in the attack at all, and now suddenly the collateral damage is enormous. Right. It gets worse. Country A decides to attack country B pretending to be country C. And a launch is made against country C, which is innocent in all of this. And maybe we even use conventional military because we think this is a national level attack. You can imagine the collateral damage there. So attribution is absolutely critical, and it's really hard.
So let's talk about that. I mean, what you're saying is identity on the net is a critical issue. So should we have to have some foolproof way that says, I'm really Larry Smarr, and now can I please use the internet? I mean, how?
So this is like the internet driver's license or something like that. Well, I hope not. I mean, I believe that anonymity or pseudonymity is a very important part of democratic societies, that people should be able to explore the net without having to say who they are. On the other hand, I don't think that people should be free to cause harm to others, but we have to do something about that. Now, I also think, though, apropos of this discussion, that if you wish to strongly authenticate yourself, you should have means for doing that. That's because some transactions really require that both parties know each other and trust each other, and you want a strong method for doing that. So I'm a big fan of two-factor authentication, of strong authentication methods, when they are appropriate. So if, for example, Larry and I are talking to each other, texting or sending email back and forth, and we want to have a private conversation, Larry might say, here's my public key, and my reaction might be, okay, that means you probably have a private key that goes with it, so I'll encrypt something in your public key and send it to you, and you can decrypt it and send it back to me in my encrypt it in my public key. So we do this little exchange. And now I have Larry and public key associated with each other, and you have Vint and my public key associated. We still don't know who each other is. We just know it's Vint and Larry. Then later, Larry shows up again. He says, hi, I'm Larry. And I'll say, well, if you're Larry, then you should be able to decrypt this secret message again. And so we go through this little handshake. So now we've had confidence that we don't know who the other party is, but we think we're still talking to the same person that we were talking to before. Now Larry asks me for a $100,000 loan. Well, suddenly I need to know more than Larry's public key. So I ask him, are you gainfully employed? Do you have any assets, and so on? And he gives me a bunch of answers that make him look like the perfect guy to loan money to. But the question is, why should I believe him? So now I need to go to a third party who manages this kind of information, or maybe several, and say, should I believe him? And assuming I can trust them, they come back and they tell me Larry's a deadbeat, so I won't hand you any of that money. But he could have said, no, I won't tell you anything. I don't want to tell you about myself. And I say, well, in that case, I'm not loaning you any money. But the point is that the escalation of identity only happens when it was needed. And I think this is not a bad tactic.
So maybe you could double click on this we that was launching the attack. There are all these different groups, certain things that whose job it is to kind of be like watching the net, policing the net, things like that. Is that scalable? And I've heard these things about cyber fire departments. Can you talk a little bit about who's watching and helping, and do we trust them?
All right. So let's parse this a little bit. This is a very good question. First of all, I want you to imagine for a moment that horror of horrors, your house is burning down, and you're standing out in front with a little fire hose, or with a garden hose, and your first reaction is, I need somebody with a bigger hose and more water. So you don't call the police department, you call the fire department. They come out and help put out the fire. But then they go and look to see, how did this fire start? And if it turned out to be evidence of arson, then they would turn this over to the police department or the FBI or something like that. So we don't have a cyber fire department. We don't have anybody to call, really. Unless we're a large enough company, we have a whole team of people. Google is a good example. We have a lot of people who are concerned with security. But small businesses and individuals don't. Now, you have to be careful with this metaphor, because if it's a fire department and there's a neighbor's house on fire, you're supposed to call the fire department. They're supposed to come out and put it out, and they're supposed to break in the windows and the ceilings or whatever else they have to do to put the fire out, because it's a danger to the community. But now suppose that you have a competitor in cyberspace, and you call the cyber fire department and have him go out, and they're saying, what's wrong? And they break in the doors and the windows, metaphorically speaking. And he's out of business for the next 3 days, and you're smiling, thinking, well, that was cool. I don't have to do that again. So the rules for calling the cyber fire department may be very different. We don't have one right now, and I think we should be exploring the possibility of doing that. So that's one point. The question about who is watching, I think what we already heard a little bit today, and I'm sure you will have encountered in other conversations in the last day or so, is that there are a number of companies that are offering to do things for you along those lines. Jeff's company is an example of that, but so are the virus companies, antivirus companies. Here, I think we're still in a period of uncertainty as to what is going to work well, and as you say, what will scale. There's no one way to do this. The attacks come in various layers in the system. They don't all come in the same place, which is why cryptography is not the solution to everything. Monitoring, however, and gathering data in real time is very important and very valuable, and analyzing it similarly. Understanding what is an attack, or what could be an attack, requires information. You have to know what's going on, what packets are flowing. One interesting thing would be to ask someone to watch the packets that are flowing out of your computer. You could imagine, if you're at home, for example, you could imagine having a box that would be watching which IP addresses are being used by your computer, what's traffic flowing back and forth. Now, you're not going to sit there and analyze all those IP addresses, but somebody else might be able to look at those and say, oh, that one is associated with a known botnet. Or this one is associated with a malware site. And you might be able to get useful feedback from that. Now, I'm just making this up on the fly. I suspect that there are going to be a number of different entities, both in the government and also in the private sector, that will offer ways to deal with these problems. We're going to have to figure out architecturally how all that's supposed to fit together. I think we're not there yet.
Yeah. Well, so there are people here, of course, that are part of corporations, but everybody, is an individual, and they're using the net. There's sort of internet hygiene. There's things that you should.
This is like, if you only brush your teeth once in your life, it doesn't work.
Exactly.
So you need to brush your teeth every day.
So what ordinary people should they do to avoid,
Well, to be really honest with you, I'm not happy with the current choices that we have as individuals. And by the way, to turn this around for a second, the U.S. is the most dependent country on technology of this kind of any place in the world. We're about 80% penetrated, and there appears to be a hardcore 20% of the American public that wants to have nothing to do with the internet. they don't consider it useful, they're afraid of it and everything else, and maybe we'll never get past that. That could be one of those asymptotic limits. But we are extremely dependent, which means we're very vulnerable because of our dependency.
Sure.
And there are people who are taking advantage of that, as you say, national state actors in some cases. Here's what's missing. I don't think that we have software that we can trust entirely because we don't know how to write software with no bugs in it. Mm-hmm. So the question is, well, what do we do about this fact of bugs and the possibility of people exploiting them? Open source is a two-edged sword. The good part is people can see the possibility of bugs. The bad guys might see the bugs and not tell anybody about it and exploit them. Just because you found a bug and fixed it in the source code doesn't mean that it's being deployed. There's
Sure.
another maintenance problem.
Right.
But there's also something very fundamentally missing, I think, in the equipment and software systems that we build. I'd like to see a lot more hardware reinforced security. We don't have that right now. 40 years ago, believe it or not, there was this project at MIT called Project Mac, which I know you're familiar with, and some of you may be as well. One of the things that they did was to rebuild a GE 635 and turned it into a 645, which had 8 rings of protection built into it to prevent you or your software from executing certain instructions without getting permission from a tiny little piece of kernel code, which you could be pretty sure about because there wasn't very much of it, so you could look at it and sort of mentally execute the whole thing. That little piece of kernel code determined whether or not you could execute privileged instructions like writing into the middle of the operating system. So that was a hardware reinforcement. They also had memory mapping, which also was a reinforcement about where you could store into the physical memory. The x86 chipsets have those capabilities, as I understand it, but we're not programming for them. Mm-hmm. We should be thinking about that. We should be designing hardware and software systems that mutually reinforce each other. Something came out of actually a national security agency effort with the private sector called the digitally signed BIOS. You know, when you turn on your machine, it runs this its basic I/O bootstrap to pull in the operating system. And the hardware now, if you get this chipset, will check a digital signature on the code that is being run for the bootstrap. And if it doesn't check, it won't run. And if you're going to update the BIOS, which also happens, the hardware will say, I won't write the new BIOS unless I can see that it has a properly signed signature on it. Now, there's an open question of who should sign. You know, is it the owner of the computer? Is it the maker of the computer? Is it is it you personally? And that could be argued. But the idea here is to start using hardware and software methods to increase the security of the system.
I can't help but notice that thing on your head. Vint is wearing glass, the Google Glass, which is not yet a commercial product, but is, of course, in the hands of a number of folks out there. My son has been wearing glass for 6 months. He's a senior.
Oh, that's a lot longer than I have. I didn't get mine until 2 weeks ago.
Well,
so, I'm a newbie.
He's at Google too. It all depends on how you rank in the company, I guess. But anyway, first of all, for those, since most everybody here hasn't worn glass, if you could just tell them a little bit about what it is as a computer and what you're able to do and see with it and how you control it just a little bit, and then we'll go some issues that it's bringing
Okay,
up.
so let me just say a little bit. First of all, it has a fair amount of memory. I think this one's got like 16 gigabytes of memory in it. It has a camera, obviously. It is capable of recording both single shots and video for 10 seconds. If you want to record more than 10, you have to tap it in order to tell it to extend the video. It accepts voice instructions, and I'll give you an example. Okay, class, take a picture. I now have a picture of Larry. I could have said record a video. I could have said make a phone call. I could have said send an email. I can configure it to receive email. I can navigate with it. If it can find a GPS receiver, it will help you navigate the same way your mobile does. For all practical purposes, this is a head-mounted mobile. I mean, in rough terms. The controls are spoken, and there's a small amount of control that you can use with your fingers. The side here is actually a pad, touchpad, so I can go up and down and back and forth. And that allows me to scroll back and forth, looking at different emails or going up and down in the hierarchy to expand an email and read it more deeply. That's just the beginning. And the reason that we have a couple of thousand of these out in sort of Explorer edition is to let people try them out, come up with new applications, and invent new ways of using this kind of capability. Some people have become agitated that somehow privacy will be significantly invaded by these kinds of devices. First observation I would make is I had to say something in order to get it to record an image, although there is an application that somebody made called Wink, which you can turn off or turn on. And apparently, I tried it and I couldn't get it to work. But you're supposed to be able to wink and have it detect that and take a picture. I think that for the same reason that when you have a mobile, it's pretty obvious that you've taken it out to take a picture, or is it? I think I mentioned to someone over coffee that I had been at a conference like this one in the middle of a break, and I was ranting about net neutrality at the time, just a few years back. And the party that I was talking to turned out to be a reporter, and I didn't know that. He held his mobile away from my view under the table, but enough to get a great shot of my chin while I was ranting. And he put it up on the net. Now, fortunately, I didn't mind because I actually have said what I was saying in public, too, so it wasn't a sudden revelation. On the other hand, I felt very offended by that. So we have this problem with these technologies, not only the Google Glass, but the mobiles and everything else, that our social conventions for dealing with this technology have not kept up with the technology.
Right.
And if it's all right, I'd like to give you an example of that. Let us imagine, for the sake of argument, that Larry is standing in front of the pyramids in Egypt, and he wants someone to take a picture of him to commemorate this. So he hands his mobile to somebody, and the person takes a picture. Now, Mark Anderson is standing nearby and is caught in the picture. You don't know Mark from from Adam. You don't care. You wanted the picture of you with the pyramid in the background. So you upload this to a website, whether it's Facebook or Google Plus or Flickr or something, and you make it publicly available because you want everybody to know that you got to go to Egypt. So someone else is roaming around looking for pyramids, and they find your picture, and they see Mark in the picture, and they say, "Oh, that's Mark." So they tag it.
They tag it. Yep.
Right. Now, later on, I'm roaming around looking for pictures of Mark, and I find this picture of Mark standing next to Larry in Egypt, in Cairo, except Mark told me that he was in London at that time. So now suddenly Mark is in trouble because of a picture you asked somebody to take that you put up on your website. Now, every one of those steps is essentially innocent, and yet the sequence results in big trouble for Mark. We have not caught up, with social conventions not caught up. Now, I won't say confident exactly. I am hopeful that we will establish conventions. When people come with their mobiles now, usually they come and say, "May I take a picture?" Right. Of course, if they're 10 feet away, that doesn't happen, and pictures get taken anyway. But imagine, when we walk down the street towards each other, we usually just get out of each other's way because it's more convenient. You can imagine a different culture where you stand there waiting for the other person to get out of the way. But we don't do that generally because it's socially convenient not to do that. It may very well be that we will have to experience some damage before we discover what the conventions are for these new technologies, and this is probably one of them.
Right. I mean, I don't know if David Brin is here yet. He was at our Starship Century symposium at Cal IT2 this last day and a half, and he's an integral part of it. But his 1990 novel, Earth, had, of course, such a society where everyone is wearing these little video cameras in their glasses. They were, at that point, it was set in the future, and they were called the geezers. That would be us at a few decades in the future. He, that's over 23 years ago, was exploring just some of these issues. And that's one of the things I've always felt is a real value of writers of all sorts, but science fiction writers in particular in this case, who tend to look at these technologies and think about the future. So this is one reason I've always supported artists engaged with everything we've done, is because they often give us more runway dealing with these issues. But this is just the start. I mean, David was talking about this 23 years ago. Now the miniaturization has caught up to where, we have one of these. Well, we'll soon have, I presume, a major competitive framework of other people making these, and then wearables generally will be. So we're going to be surrounded.
We'll be surrounded in many different dimensions. The Fitbit, for example, and your own personal digitization are examples of what's to come.
We're all wearing a Fitbit, right?
Yay. I didn't get mine yet. I don't know where it is.
It's in the goodie bag.
It's in the goodie bag. I didn't get a goodie bag yet. Okay.
Well, we can fix
I'll
that.
go get my goodie bag. So, actually, Google issued Fitbits to everybody at Google.
No, it's happening a lot these days.
So, but it's more than just wearing things that are sensing our bodily functions and vital signs and so on. We're also seeing Mark Weiser's vision of ubiquitous computing happening, and his way of expressing it was that it would just melt into the background.
Right.
And so every light bulb and every appliance and every piece of furniture and everything else, every building, every room would become part of this online environment. You walk into a room in a hotel, your mobile figures out that there are high-resolution displays available. It can now present what it was on the tiny screen on the big screen. It's been told what room it's in the hotel. If there's an emergency and you hit emergency button, the information that goes to the emergency responders is not only what the physical address is, but also what room you were in at the time, and maybe even other information like what's your current vital signs if that happened to be available. So we are going to be immersed in this sea of information, and it will have, as always, these two sides to it. One of them is tremendous benefit to all of us, keeping us healthier, keeping us safer, and everything else. And the other side of it is a society which is increasingly transparent, which is another book that David Brin wrote, called The Transparent Society, which specifically gets to this, and that's, a decade ago.
Yeah. No, that's why David's such a valuable member of the FiRe community. So, we have a few minutes left here. This is your opportunity to ask Vint the question you always wanted to ask him.
Uh-oh.
It doesn't have to be necessarily on this topic, but if you could use the microphones, go ahead and compose your thoughts. There we go.
So I'm going to ask for some help. We'll see how the audio works. I'm hearing impaired, so if it doesn't make sense, it's not because you're crazy. It's because I didn't hear. But let's try.
That's all right. I'm crazy too.
Yeah.
As one of the leading lunatics out propagating this concept of hardware-based security, the great observation we've had in the last 4 or 5 months is that the fundamental piece we've been missing is that mobile is really a transformation of a network based on spectrum to a network based on machine ID.
That's interesting.
And then fundamentally, that means that we might be able to add 1 billion PC devices to the mobile network because they're already provisioned with the tools to have tamper-resistant machine ID. And what instantly has flown out of that is the concept of device identity and its capabilities. And the device identity and its capabilities changes entirely how you can look at what a device can do. Could it present a certain capability of services or protection of content? And what we find is really interesting as you look at the BIOS integrity that you talked about that's coming out of the US government. We were part of causing that to happen. Bringing those pieces of infrastructure allow us to have a network not controlled by spectrum, what wire you're plugged into. But you can almost close your eyes and think of the cloud, and it actually is a network of identity of devices. Mm-hmm. And that model makes so much of this easier because I can have an infinite number of walled gardens. Everybody gets their own.
So let's get Vint's.
That's actually interesting, although I was with you up to the walled garden part, which I'm not quite sure I agree with, but let me set that aside for a moment. one of the interesting things about self-forming networks is the possibility of making these devices cooperate with each other. I'm sure you'd be amused to know that this store and forward self-forming network turned out to be a very important part of the interplanetary internet design, which is now in operation between Earth, Mars, and the International Space Station. The whole idea was that the nodes would hold information until communications capability was available. And so if you're in a disrupted environment, and if it's not an application that requires absolute real time, these systems are helping each other out. Now, it's obvious that if you're going through other people's machines as part of this self-forming cloud-like environment, you're going to want to encrypt things because you don't want everybody looking. It's like the hot dog in the baseball game, where it comes from the end over here, and by the time you get it, you have a little bit of the bun left because everybody took a bite of the hot dog. So you don't want that to happen to your information in this environment. But I think the extension of what you're suggesting is the possibility of literally every node in this system being a little femtocell in and of itself. By the way, that's going to make a big difference for emergency communications, because now instead of having to rely on base stations and other things that could become damaged in a serious event, these systems are essentially self-forming. So I don't think we will have to wait very long before we start seeing things like that happen. And of course, when we get up to the really high frequencies, like 60 gigahertz, 120 gigahertz, the bandwidths are going to be really dramatic. Right. The most recent report that I just saw was a 240 gigahertz frequency transmission at 40 gigabits per second. Right. And that's not a very big piece of the 240 gigahertz frequency. Of course, it doesn't propagate all that far, but then
short range.
You get to reuse the frequency over and over again. So yes, one more.
Another question over here.
Yeah, have you found that the increased militarization of space has made architecting the interplanetary internet more difficult?
I'm sorry, you're fading out.
Has the increased militarization of space interfered at all with making the interplanetary internet?
It has not raised its head, fortunately. The primary, in fact, interestingly enough, it was DARPA that sponsored the interplanetary design to begin with, and didn't do that for military reasons, at least not that I know of. I think it did it because they thought this was a really cool thing to do. And by the way, we applied it terrestrially to military tactical communication. It is applicable to space communication because you can do relay across multiple satellites as a way of overcoming lack of ground-based facility or loss of a ground-based facility. But I have not detected a problem with regard to militarization. I hope it stays that way. We should keep space a peaceful place.
Vint, Simon Hackett. A few years ago, as you had said, you were talking about net neutrality stuff with various levels of ranting on above and below tables. Where's your view of the net neutrality problem got to these days?
So I consider that this net neutrality problem persists. And the big worry that all of us had, me included, is that if there isn't a great deal of competition among the service providers, so imagine each of us is a consumer, what choice do we have in our location, in our homes or in our businesses? If we have very little choice, then the market from our point of view is not adjusted by competition. It's not managed by competition. And when you have no competition, you have the potential for abusive practices. And the thing that worried us most is that those who control a really broadband connection and we're offering higher level services. Video is an example, and I'm not picking on any particular supplier here. But if your business is to supply video and internet and, say, telephone services, and you discover that other people are using your high-speed internet service to deliver video and telephone services, and you would like them not to be able to compete with you, then if you can jigger their service over the internet to prevent them from succeeding, then you've abused your control over this lower-level pipe. And when the FCC abandoned the idea of transport in the communication architecture, remember Computer 1, 2, and 3, and this notion of a bright boundary between application spaces and underlying transport. They abandoned that and made everything information service, which is it's not an accurate characterization of the way the Internet's designed. So I think we still have a problem. And one wonders whether the scenario we just talked about before you asked about what would happen if we had this froth of cloud that we were all contributing to, and we didn't need a carrier to manage it. Maybe that would change everything. But for the moment, it's still a problem here in the U.S. and possibly elsewhere as well.
So one last quick question.
I'll make it quick. Could you comment a little bit on the history of the Internet and what you were thinking in the beginning about security, designing security, and if you had to do it again, what would you do differently?
I missed the last
So
part.
what if you were admitting
If I were doing it all over again?
Yeah.
Well, okay, so I have to tell you that I did do it at the beginning. By 1975, when 2 years into the design of the Internet, I started working with NSA on the design of a secured Internet. The problem is that the technology of that time was classified, and so I could not reveal to any of my uncleared colleagues what the implications were for building a secure network. Eventually what we were doing turned into the Blacker packet encryption system. Since that time, remember in 1977, public key crypto is speculated about by Whit Diffie and Marty Hellman at Stanford. But 1977, they had the paper, but no implementations. In 1978, we basically standardized the TCP/IP protocols. So we couldn't use that technology. Today, though, this is widely used technology. We have elliptic crypto as an example. Most modern versions. The problem that we have is that quantum computing is breathing down our back. And so factorization as a work factor may turn out not to be adequate. And you can imagine there are a number of people well aware of this and having to look for something else to do. So if we were starting all over again, I would have used public key crypto. But in 2013, that may not be enough either.
Thanks so much, Ben.
Okay, thank you all.